Hi, today I'd like to step through one of Palantir's tutorials available on learn.palantir.com. That tutorial is called Deep Dive Building Your First Pipeline. Rather than step through each step verbatim, we're going to stick to the core workflow. I'll leave the bulk of the reading to you. By the end of this, you'll have a pipeline deployed on your stack, and you should feel comfortable navigating around the application and start feeling like you want to explore some of the more advanced features. We'll point you at those advanced features, but they are out of scope for this training. Let's go ahead and get started. Okay, here we are at learn.palantir.com. It's currently under the featured courses section, building your first pipeline. If you don't see it here, however, use that search bar in the upper right. You can search for it by keyword. The course will pop up. Click Take Course, and here's what happens. You get the agenda. Here are all of the modules within this training that we're going to complete. We are not going to open every single one of these. Some of these are very text heavy. You should read them though. Great context. They're going to give you info that's going to help you complete the training, get the training that you need. About this course, we'll review the learning objectives, things that you should know or have practice with once you're done with the training. There are just a couple things I'm going to call out from the overview and setting up your project and folder section here. First, here's an image from the introduction section. A pipeline in Foundry is a series of input data sets or data set that's transformed in some way to generate an output data set or data sets. Those outputs can in turn be used as inputs to the next segment of the pipeline, and that can continue until you are left with a series of data sets that support your workflow. Pipelines are built in service of something in Foundry. Sometimes they might be built to structure a data set so that it can be ready for analysis. It might be to shape a data set so that it can back an ontology object type. Maybe it's to be used as an input to a model. Regardless, when data lands in from a raw source, it typically needs to undergo some kind of cleaning, preparation exercise, enrichment exercise, in order to make it ready for whatever it is we brought it into Foundry to do in the first place. We're going to be operating inside this green box today. We are going to be simulating data ingestions by uploading data into Foundry. We will apply some cleaning, and we will generate some outputs, and we'll talk about some best practices along the way. In order to get started, you need to make sure you have a training project, a place where you can reliably save and store your artifacts during training. There might be a place already in your Foundry platform where you can do this. On many Foundry instances, you'll find a project that comes out of the box with Foundry called temporary training artifacts. On other Foundry instances, it might be called tutorial practice artifacts. Search and see if you've got that. Maybe your organization already has a project that's set up for you to build all of your learning paths. Go ahead and use that. The one in my Foundry instance here is called My Data Project. So I'm going to go ahead and click into that. If you don't have one, please check in with your Foundry administrator first to make sure that you have permissions and everything that you need in order to create a project. Otherwise, you can search for tutorial practice artifacts or temporary training artifacts in your filter projects here. And once you find it, go ahead and click into it. I'm going to go ahead and click into mine. It's called My Data Project. And the important thing here is to make sure I've got access to the project, but I also have the editor role on the project, which means I've got this green new button in the upper right part of the screen. I want to make sure that I have the ability to add new resources into this project. Notably, I want to make sure that I have the ability to add a pipeline builder application because that's where we'll be spending most of our time. So make sure you've got that situated. Once you do, we can go ahead and continue with the training. Okay, so we're now in the data pre-processing and cleaning module. In the introduction, we're told what it is we're going to be doing. We have some notional data sets here, products, customers, and transactions. It looks like we're going to be doing some cleaning here. This is a snapshot of the pipeline builder application. The next lesson in here tells us to download the data sources. 3 data sources we're going to be downloading. These are all raw. Notice they have different extensions. We won't talk too much about those, but we can upload different data types into Foundry and have it either apply a schema or apply some transformations so that it can understand the schema. So we have data. We have a location where we can build artifacts. Let's go ahead and get started. So here I am in my project. So we have our data, we have a location. Let's go ahead and start building. The tutorial prompts you to build some folder. I'm going to put a folder in my project called Building Your First Pipeline. and I'll go ahead and open it. So I'm still in my project, just in this folder, and I'm going to add a pipeline builder artifact. I can do that by clicking the green new button either in the middle of the screen or in the upper right, and we're going to look for builder pipeline. We'll go ahead and click it. This is going to open a blank pipeline builder artifact. It asks us to give this a name first. I'm going to go ahead and just say my first pipeline. It gives us an option of choosing between batch and streaming. We can talk about that later. We'll go ahead and create the pipeline. So here we are in our empty pipeline. We're going to start by uploading data from our computer. This is the data that we just uploaded or downloaded from the learn.palantir.com site. We'll click upload from your computer, and then you're just going to choose the data. Now, we're going to start by just importing the Parquet file and the CSV file. CSV, you're probably familiar with. Parquet is a columnar data store that's really optimized for working with Spark, which is a compute engine that is frequently what Foundry transformations are using. We'll go ahead and click open for those two. And notice our options here give us the ability to upload as a structured data set. Foundry is going to infer the schema based on the CSV, based on the Parquet file. We can check that schema, make sure that it's okay. Also, we have the ability to rename these very lengthy file names here. And let's remove this front matter where we have this non-human readable string here. It says public and then a string of numbers. And we can leave this to just say, let's leave this as products_raw. I'll do the same thing underneath. We'll call this customers_raw and go ahead and click upload. So now we have data sets on our graph represented as nodes. As we click on them, note we have some windows down at the bottom here that give us a preview of the data. We can close that window if we need to. We can move these around. We're going to get to the interface here in just a minute, but we've got those two data sets in here. Let's add the third one in. We'll be doing it the same way. Add data, and we're going to add data. Browse and upload from your computer. And this time, let's find out JSON. Now, we couldn't do it in the same motion that we did the CSV and Parquet files because we're going to load this data in as an empty data set. It doesn't have a schema. It is just composed of this JSON file. We'll go ahead and click upload. It gives it this just very generic data set name, which we can go in and change in a bit here. I can right click, rename, and let's call this transactions raw. Okay, so at this point we should have 3 data sets. Do note here, if I'm looking at a preview of the data, the products show up in a tabular format. The customers show up in a tabular format. The transactions raw, however, just list this JSON file. Remember, data sets are composed of files in Foundry. And in a transaction that transforms that data, those files are rearranged, combined, partitioned. And so data sets are composed of one or more files. This one is composed of a single file. It's a JSON file. It's not currently in a human readable form. If we do go over here and click preview, we can get a preview of what the data is. Notice it is in JSON. It's a series of dictionaries here. It's a list of dictionaries. Okay, so we have data in. Now it's time to start our cleaning step. Okay, we're going to start with the products raw data set here. Let's click on it. Check out the preview at the bottom. I see this is a 50-row data set. What in here might need to get cleaned up? As I expand the product name, I see these small dots that are after some of the product names. This indicates an extra white space. It's good to trim all the white spaces, especially if we're doing histograms or things where we're like doing some aggregations, grouping things. We'll want to make sure that these have identical names so that they get grouped correctly. So that's number 1. Number 2, I see that there's a price column here. It's got numeric values in here. It looks like dollars and cents, but it is currently set to be a string. That's going to prevent us from doing numeric operations on the data in here. So let's take that as our second action we want to take, is that we want to cast this price column as a double rather than as a string. Let's take care of both of those. We're going to click on the data set that we want to transform, and we get a window that opens on the right side with a number of options. One of them is transform. So we'll go ahead and click transform. When we click transform, we have a new interface. This is where we apply our transforms in sequence, top to bottom. And the first thing we're looking for here is we want to trim that white space. We can search for all of the expressions here by keyword. We can do trim. We'll choose trim white space, and we want to pick the column that we want to apply trim white space to, and it is the product name. We'll keep this product name column the same. If we gave this a new name, it would produce a new column here called product names. But notice if we have the identical name, it simply lists here that is going to replace the column. We'll click apply. Once we click apply, we get a preview of what the data will look like. We haven't changed our data yet. We're still just kind of evaluating the changes that we want to make. But we do see that those little dots have gone away, which indicates that the white space has been trimmed. Second order of business here, let's go ahead and just underneath, we'll apply another transform. That's what this search bar is here. It gives us the ability to search for another transform, another expression to use. And here we're going to use cast. If you've worked with SQL or Python before, you're familiar with cast or operations that are similar to cast. Cast allows us to take a data type and transform it into another data type. So we'll choose cast, and here's the interface. What is the column that we want to apply the cast to? It's going to be price. What is the type that we want to cast it to? It's currently a string. That's what this little icon means. Well, we want to cast it to a double. We'll keep the same name. Go ahead and apply. One thing to notice here is that when we perform an operation on a column in Pipeline Builder, it's going to put that column at the head of the schema. It really wants to just let us know that it did it. It puts it in a prominent place where we can check it out. So that looks good so far. We now have a numeric value that we can do something with. I'm going to go ahead now and click save. Actually, one more thing that I'm going to do here before I get too far is the upper left part of the screen here will allow us to name our transform path. We'll see why this is useful in a second when we return to the graph. What visual cues about what our blocks on our graph are doing. And this transform path is going to be clean products. So I'll hit enter, so I now have a name for this block. Now I'll click save. And then just underneath there, I'm going to click back to graph. And so I've got a node here that represents the input data. And now I have a node that represents the cleaned data, and I can get a preview of it down below. I haven't changed the data yet, but I have a transform that looks good so far. The next step in the tutorial is called advanced transforms. We're going to be cleaning the customer's raw data set. It's called advanced because the operations we're going to be performing just require a little bit more finesse and precision. They're just a little bit more advanced. Let's check out that customer's raw data set. Click customers raw. By the way, I've got this panel open on the right side. I'd like some more real estate to work. I can close these at any time. If I click them, they open. If I re-click the button, then they close. Now I've got a nice full view of the table. A few things about the customer's raw data. First, the address column is not a human readable address. It's a struct to data type, which is a composite data type. And if you've worked with data a lot in the past, you might recognize this as a dictionary. We have some keys and values, street, city, state. We just want to turn this into a human readable field. Nobody looks at addresses this way. The other thing's a little bit more nuanced. The customer ID column should be a unique primary key, and I want to check to make sure that it's unique. This is especially important if this data set is or will eventually back an ontology object type. We want to make sure that one row in the backing data set accurately calls out one object of the type. And we do that by preserving the uniqueness of the primary key. Let's check it. Let's check it out. We can click the drop-down arrow next to the column header, customer ID, click the drop-down, and I'm going to click view stats. This is going to give me a histogram view of the values in this column. It's a string type, and so it gives me a histogram like this. If it were numeric type, it gives me more of a distribution. And I can see already right off the bat, there are several records that have duplicated IDs. I'm going to click one on the bottom and then hold Shift, and I've got them all selected. So here are all of the IDs that have duplicate values or duplicate rows. I'm going to choose Keep Values. I'm just filtering superficially here to investigate the column. I'm not changing any data. I'm not even creating a transform here. I'm just continuing my investigation. I'm going to click Keep Values. I'm going to click the X here. I don't need a histogram anymore. Instead, I have a little filter applied here for just the duplicated IDs. Some of these look fine. Emails, names, addresses, everything's in here. Some of them down below have null values in here. So let's do this. Let's introduce a transform that filters out the rows where the email, the name, and the address are null. So those are the two things we want to do. We want to filter these out, and then we want to change that structured field into a nice human readable address. We're going to start the same way we did the other one. We'll click on Customers Raw, and we're going to click Transform. Give myself a little bit more room to work here. Keep that preview open at the bottom. So here, our transform is going to be a filter. So I'm going to start typing the word filter. I have a few different filter operations that I can pursue. I'm going to choose filter rows. I want to filter out some of my rows. So rather than filter to, which is what keep rows is, I'm going to filter out by removing rows that match all of the following conditions. First, the address column is null. And we're going to treat empty strings as if they were null. And we'll just repeat that for the other two properties, email and name. So this time, where the email is null, and then finally, where the name is null, we'll click Apply. And the way we can check this really quickly here is we'll click Customer ID, we'll view the stats, and we can see that now this looks a lot better. We don't have any duplicated values. The second one we want to do here, let's return to our preview. We have our address field. We want to take this structured data field and we want to make it more human readable. There's a few different steps to get there. The tutorial walks you through them. We're going to do them together here. The transform that we're going to use here is called flatten struct. We're going to take this JSON structure, we're going to flatten it. So we'll choose flatten struct. I'm going to give myself a little bit more room to work here. Okay, so now we need to choose an expression to flatten this structured data. We click in, what we want to search for here is parse JSON as struct. This is a JSON dictionary here. We have key value pairs in these curly braces. We're gonna pick parse JSON as struct. What it wants now is a sample of the schema. This will return a little bit later in another transform we're going to do. So really all we need to do here is I'm going to right click into one of the cells, arbitrarily pick one of the cells in the address column. It doesn't really matter. We'll pick copy. That will copy the value. We're going to paste it into this big field here. That's all we need to do. We need to tell it to basically infer the schema from the structured data type. So we'll generate schema, and it very easily pulls out, okay, you have a thing called a city, a state, and a street. It looks like they're strings, but we could change those data types if we needed to. We need to also tell it which column contains the JSON. We'll click in there. We'll tell it it's the address column. And here's the schema. And now we'll go ahead and apply. I think technically the tutorial changes this separator to a blank space. It doesn't really matter. This separator is in case there are nested structs in our structured data type. We don't have that, so we're okay. But look what it did. So it created 3 new columns, city, state, street. We'd still like them in a single field called address, or a single column called address. So there's 2 more operations that we need to do. We still have our address column here that has the struct data type. Let's concatenate these in the correct order. We'll separate them by a comma. And then we will delete these 3 columns as we'll no longer need them after we have reconstructed the address field, the address column. First order of business, we're going to do a new transform just underneath, and we'll lower that. We're going to use the concatenate strings. We have some strings. We want to bring them together into a single field. For us, our separator is going to be a comma. We're going to have comma separation between our concatenated strings. Let's choose our columns. So first, what we want is the street. And then we want the city. We'll add an item. And for this one, we'll put the state. The default name for this new column it gives it is concat strings. That doesn't really suit us. We're going to put address. And notice when we type address, it says you're going to replace the column that is currently called address. That's exactly what we want. So we're going to go ahead and click apply. We can verify that worked now. It throws that column at the front of our schema. And we have a nice now human readable. And actually, you know what we might want to do here is the separation should be a comma and then a space. So let's go back and edit that. We'll come in here, we'll edit. So we want a comma and then a space. Will be our separator. We'll apply. That should look a lot better. Yeah. So that looks like a real address. The other address field has been now replaced. And the final thing we can do here now is drop columns. The columns we want to drop are the ones that we created. These are these convenience columns that we derived from the struct data field that we concatenated into a new address field. We no longer need city, state, or street. Apply. And now we have a schema that's really workable. Let's name this transform path in the upper left of the screen. We'll call this customers clean. Let's save it, and we'll head back to the graph. Oh, it looks like we called one clean products, clean customers. If we need to change the name, we can step in, we can edit it. Let's call it clean customers. Save it back to the graph. Okay. All right. So we're ready to do a cleaning step on our final data set here. Typically, when you're working with data sets in Foundry, you're working with a collection of Parquet files that compose the data set. Foundry is capable of working with lots of data types. We have a data set here that is composed of a single file type. It's a JSON file. Pipeline Builder makes it very easy to access those raw files, transform them into data sets that we can work with that have a tabular look and feel to them. That's going to be our first order of business with transactions raw. Once we do that, we'll take a look at the schema. We'll see if there are other things we need to do to clean it up. So first of all, we click on the data set node here in Pipeline Builder. We see we don't have a preview of the data. We just have the name of the raw JSON file. Let's go ahead and click transform. Also notice there are many fewer options here because this data set hasn't been materialized as a tabular data set. We need to actually take this raw JSON, convert it into a data set. We'll click transform. And from here, what we're going to do is we're going to extract rows from a JSON file. There's already a limited number of operations we can perform on this node because it is a raw JSON file sitting inside of a data set. We'll extract rows from a JSON file. We just saw this. We want a sample of the schema. We can get it directly here from Pipeline Builder. We have our raw JSON file in the preview window down below. If we mouse over it, one of our options is to preview that data. If we preview the data, we get a list of dictionaries here. And we're going to just choose the top record. Notice there's a number 1. So we're going to highlight everything that is in line number 1. This is technically one full line, but it's being wrapped here for convenience. We're going to pick that first record. I'm going to copy, head back over, and I'm going to paste it in here. So we have one of the sample records from the JSON itself. We'll click Generate Schema. And look how easily it takes each field from that JSON, parses it, assigns it a type. This toggle here, we're going to move to the off position. We have one row in the JSON that represents one record. It doesn't span multiple lines, so we're going to go ahead and toggle this to the off position. And then we'll go ahead and click apply. Notice now in our preview down below, we actually have a tabular view of the data. We've parsed the JSON without writing any code. Very handy for working with raw files like CSVs and JSONs. So we have a number of ID fields here. The first thing I want to call attention to is we have a transaction date. It's a string. It has a unique format. It has the day of the week, the month, the day, the year. They're not comma separated. We have a time. GMT plus zeros is Greenwich Mean Time. There's some that are in British Summer Time. We need to format this. We probably want to do some kind of date operation down the road. So let's go ahead and cast this as a timestamp. That'll be our first operation just underneath extract rows from a JSON file. We'll click and we're going to do cast once again. What's the column we want to cast? It's the transaction date. Let's cast it as a timestamp. Our time zone is going to be London, British summertime. And then what it asks is for, if you've transformed data using SQL and converted things to or from timestamps, the system will want to know what's the format that I should be reading it from. How should I interpret the data that I'm looking at? Sometimes this can be frustrating, and you'll spend some time on Stack Overflow trying to find the right syntax for defining the format. One thing we could try is mousing over view available format symbols, and we could muscle our way through the format string. Or we can engage Foundry's AI assistant to try to help us to generate that format string based on one of the provided values. So let's just pick a value down here in the transaction date column. I'm just going to pick the top one. I'll click copy, and I'm going to click generate. This is going to open a window where the AI assistant is saying, give me one of your values. I will generate the format string for this particular transform. You'll notice inconsistent performance here. This is engaging a large language model. So I'm going to enter my format string and I'm going to click generate. Now, if you get a message down below that says unable to parse the string, give it a few more tries. If that fails, for this particular tutorial, they've given you the format string here. You can simply copy this and paste it in. If for some, either you don't have the AI assistant, or for some reason you're getting an error that you're not able to work through, go ahead and just grab the string and put it in. But look, it has generated the string for me. Fantastic. I'll go ahead and click apply, and then we'll look at our result. Our transaction date is now formatted as a nice timestamp column. I can see at least two more things that we need to do to clean this data. First, the units column is clearly numeric. We want to perform some numeric operations on this column later. Let's cast this from a string to a double. The other thing that I'm noticing is that there are a couple of extra columns that were added when we converted the file from JSON to a more tabular format. So I actually just want to drop those columns. So we'll do a cast operation and we'll drop some columns. We've done a cast before. We know how to enter that transform here. But what if we just had no idea how to get started? I know I want to do a thing to a column. I just don't know how to do it. Again, here we can engage Foundry's AI assistant. So out to the right of our search transforms and columns field, we have a generate button here. If we click generate, we can simply tell Pipeline Builder what it is that we want to do. And the prompt in the training says, how do I cast units as a double? And we'll simply click generate, and Pipeline Builder will construct the transform that we need in order to conduct the operation we've requested. So it'll step through a few steps here. And here we end up with units as a double. The training texts notes that you may note some missing items here. It doesn't actually look like there's anything going on in this transform block. You can then go in and explicitly do it. This is really kind of a placeholder. The Pipeline Builder is indicating we're doing what you asked. Look, the data is definitely shaped the right way. However, you might need to do a little bit of formatting in the expression block up here. I'm going to go ahead and leave this for now, but just note that either if you don't have the AI assistant or for some reason you're not getting exactly what you want, you can simply do a cast transform block, just like we did before, and cast it. Okay, the last thing, we want to drop these two columns. We've done this before. Let's drop columns, and the columns we want to drop are file and error. Apply. And now it looks like we've got a nicely scoped data set with the columns we want in the format that we want. I'm going to go ahead and rename this to clean transactions. I'll hit enter, and now I'm going to click save, and I'd like to return to the graph to see my work. Okay, this looks a lot like the example picture we were shown in the introduction to this module. We're going to take a series of inputs. We're going to transform them so that they're cleaned. We've reached the data integration, joining, and aggregations module of the tutorial. We're going to be doing just that. We're going to join some of our nodes together. We're going to do an aggregation. We're going to investigate a bad join. And importantly, we're going to be generating some outputs from our pipeline. Let's get to work. The instructions tell us that we're eventually going to work toward creating a customer lifetime value data set. We're going to start by joining clean transactions with clean products. This is going to give us an idea about the value of each transaction as we work toward that customer lifetime value data set. Let's click Clean Transactions. And in the window that pops up to the right, instead of clicking Transform, we're going to click Join. That defines clean transactions as the left side of the join. It's now asking for the right. Select on graph. We want to choose clean products. And Start opens the join interface. This should look familiar if you have joined data with any other kind of low-code, no-code application. We define the type of join. It's a left join. We want to match on just a single condition. In our case, it's the product ID. In the left data set matches the product ID in the right data set. In order to prevent column collisions, we can prefix the columns in the right data set, which is the products data set, with products underscore, or maybe product underscore. So that will prefix all of the columns with product underscore. We can then bring in product variation ID. We don't need the product ID again here because we've already got it here. You ever join defined? I'm in the upper left part of the screen here. You can put whatever you want. The tutorial has a particular convention that they like, but I might say join with a colon, transactions and products. Hit enter. I'm going to click apply, and we get a preview of our joined data down below. This is a left joined. So what I would expect is I'm going to have my transactions on the left. As I scroll over, I have my product information that has been added in. It looks like, at least a superficial look at this, looks like there's no null rows here. I'm going to go ahead and click save and go back to my graph. Let's further enhance our data by now joining in the customers data set, or the customers clean transform here. Same thing. We're going to click transactions and products. And we're going to click, instead of transform here, we're again going to do join. Same thing, we'll click join. That's the left side of the join. The right side is going to be clean customers. We'll go ahead and start a left join. Nice and easy. We're just joining on the customer ID. There's a shared customer ID. Makes it very easy. What's also nice here is we don't have any column collisions. We don't need to add a prefix here. If you want to add a prefix that says customer, that's perfectly fine. The tutorial doesn't instruct you to do that. And we're ready to go. Let's apply. And we'll check this out. It's a left join. And so we'll want to just make sure we get customer data appended on the right side. And there's our customer data. Looks good so far. Let's name this transform node here, join customers, transactions, products. That might be kind of a long name, doesn't show up very well on the graph. We pick one that is maybe a little shorter. We'll go ahead and save. Let's head back to our graph and see how we look. Okay, we're now ready for an important step in our pipeline, and that is materializing outputs from our transforms. Let's generate 2 output data sets. We'll come back into another in a moment. I would like a data set that just has the transactions and the products joined, and I would like a data set that has everything joined. Essentially, I want a data set that looks just like the preview here, maybe with a few modifications. For example, in my schema, I don't know that I want the units to come first. You might be used to a particular schema structure where you have the primary key on the left side of the table. That's common. It's not critical, but let's say I want to change this schema before we materialize it. We'll talk about that. Let's start by materializing the transactions and products transform here. So we're going to click on the join node here that joins transactions and products. And we're going to mouse over add output. Our pipeline is going to have its first output. There's a number of output types we can choose from. We're going to choose new data set. We're going to materialize a new data set here. And now we have a new interface open on the right side of the screen. This is our pipeline outputs panel. We have a new node on our graph, generically named new data set with today's timestamp. Let's call this joined transactions products. Use whatever casing you want. I'm using snake case here. If you use title case, that's fine. Use the convention that you typically use at your organization. I'll hit enter. There's some other options here. These are a little more advanced. Let's look down below at the schema. We have an opportunity here using these 8 dots next to each of our columns here to reorder these. If I wanted to put, for example, product ID up top, transaction ID up top, and reorder this, this is an opportunity for me to change the output schema. Okay, I'm just changing the column order here. I'm not changing the data types. Okay. So rearrange this however you want, not super critical at this point. We just want to make sure you know we can change the schema here. Okay, let's do the same thing for this joined transform down below here where we join everything together. We'll click on the node, find that output, add output. We're going to create a new data set. This one we'll name joined, this is going to be a mouthful, customers, transactions, products. We'll hit enter. Same thing, we might want to change the schema. Maybe we want the customer IDs first, the transaction ID, product ID, however we would want to arrange that. Okay. So 2 data sets here, but notice in the blocks underneath it says not yet deployed, not yet deployed. We have defined the specification for this data set, but we have not told Foundry to build them yet. Here's how we do this in Pipeline Builder. Once we've defined them, we'll click Save, and then we'll click on Deploy. Deploy is Pipeline Builder's word for build. We're going to deploy this pipeline. It will execute the logic on the inputs, and it will generate the outputs. We can select the data sets to build. It says, here's 2 new ones. These haven't been deployed. We can uncheck any of the ones we don't want to build. We'll go ahead and click Deploy Pipeline. When the build starts, you'll notice a few subtle things happen in the upper right part of the screen. Number 1, you'll see an indication that the pipeline is deploying. Another thing you'll notice is just to the right here, there's a set of monitored items. These are either things you produced in the past or things that you have elected to be notified about. And here I can see that there is something running here. I'm going to control click on this item, and we're going to pivot over to another part of Foundry that essentially watches the build. This is called the job tracker. And the job tracker application will show how builds are progressing. So we have a build that is composed of 2 jobs. Each job corresponds with a data set. So a data set corresponds with a job here. The build is composed of multiple data sets. There's a lot we can do here. We can monitor the progress of the build as it happens. If we want to get really into the weeds, we can even click into one of the jobs and crack open the Spark details. It's a little more advanced than we're equipped to handle today in this particular tutorial, but do explore that if that's of interest. Okay, I can see that both of these succeeded fairly quickly. I'm gonna head back. It says successfully deployed pipeline. I get green check marks, and now notice it says deployment is up to date. What that means is these are now materialized data sets in Foundry. Where did they go? Where did they get deployed? Well, they get deployed in the same location that your pipeline builder artifact is stored. You can end up moving them to different locations, but by default, that's what happens. So if I right click on one of these and I were to choose open, it will open the built data set. Notice the file path, my data project, building your first pipeline. It put the data set directly in there. This is the data set view. This should look familiar to you. Built by yours truly. We have the metadata on the left side of the screen, and then we have our data set over here in the center of the screen. So we might just take for granted that we did everything correctly. The tutorial prompts us to go back and investigate our join to make sure that we actually get the uniqueness that we would expect. The tutorial instructs you to do this in Contour. You're definitely free to do that, but I'm going to show you a way to do it entirely in Pipeline Builder. You don't even need to leave Pipeline Builder to go to Contour to do this. Choose whichever avenue you want to go down. We're going to click into the joined transactions products data set here, and we're going to note a couple things. First, if I expand the product ID and the transaction ID here, I actually get this visual cue that maybe we don't have uniqueness here. We have duplicated product IDs, duplicated transactions IDs, and remember we can use the drop down in the column heading to view statistics on a column. So this is the transaction ID. We have multiplicity here. In fact, we have a good amount of it here. What I can do is I can pick on one of these. Let's keep one of those values and just investigate that particular value. And you see we got replicated product IDs, replicated units, transaction dates. Everything here is exactly the same until we get to the product data that's added to the end, that's joined in. I see different prices here, and what's actually unique here is this product variation ID. These are unique. So I'm going to go ahead and change my join from joining on the product ID to joining on the product variation ID. And then we'll redeploy the pipeline with the fix and see how we look. I'm going to close this screen, at least give me some more real estate to work here. Let's go to our join. How do I edit a node here? It's essentially what we're doing. Let's click on the join transactions and products node, and we'll go down to edit. Click the pencil icon, edit, and we're simply going to change the key that this is being joined on. So instead of on product ID, we're going to join on variation ID. Same here, we'll join on variation ID. Let's go ahead and apply. And then we can do a quick test. Let's check in to the transaction ID, view the stats. And now we've got unique transaction IDs. And of course, if we click in here now, we can see we'll have a unique product here on that transaction. That looks great. That's what we expect. Let's click Save, head back to our graph, and we'll notice something about our output nodes here that says changes not deployed. Changes not deployed. We've made changes in our logic that have not actually been propagated out to the data sets that we're materializing from our pipeline. So in order to do that, we want to make sure we save and then deploy. Deploy pipeline. Okay, we've finished our deployments. Our data sets are now up to date. We can see that we have 50 rows, and our input data sets also have 50 rows. Before, this join showed 172 rows. That was also another clue that we had done something wrong, potentially, where maybe we have some multiplicity that's happening. I forgot to call that out, but that was one way we could have found that we maybe had some skew in our data. So we're ready for the next step. We have some outputs here. Let's do one more step. That's going to be our aggregation. That'll be our final step here. In this step, we're going to create a tightly scoped data set that has customers, their name and address, and their total revenue over time. We're going to call this the customer lifetime value data set. So we'll do a transform, and then we'll generate an output data set. Let's start by clicking on the Join Customers, Transactions, Products transform. And we're going to add a new transform on top of that one, where we're going to add in an aggregated value of transactions per customer. Our transform here is going to be called multiply. We want to multiply some numbers together to create something called revenue. And we get revenue by multiplying our product price times the number of units. Notice we chose multiply numbers. It knows what columns are numeric. It's not proposing string columns for us to use here. So that makes it kind of easy for us to choose the correct columns. And we're going to call this revenue. We'll go ahead and apply. And that's fine. This is going to give us our revenue for each line, but we want to aggregate this by customer. So we're going to change the shape of this data set pretty significantly, similar to how we might do a group by in a SQL transform. So here we're going to choose aggregation or aggregate as our transform. And let's choose our group by columns. We have a bunch to choose from. We're going to choose customer ID. Let's also choose the name and address. Now for our aggregations. Let's choose a sum of revenue. Okay, and we'll leave this as revenue and go ahead and apply. Notice what we're doing here, it's going to dramatically change the shape of our table below. Let's click apply and see what happens. All right, so we've got a limited number of customers here. We have their address and we have the total revenue as a double. Maybe there's more formatting we want to do there. Let's assume our schema looks good and we want to produce an output data set. Let's save. We will head back to the graph. Maybe we should rename this transform path too. Let's rename this to aggregate customer revenue. And from here, just like we did before, we'll click on our new transform node and we'll choose add output. New data set. And our data set will be named customer lifetime value. Our schema looks good. I like it. Save, and we'll deploy our pipeline. Now we don't need to rebuild everything here. Notice there are already some data sets that are up to date. We don't need to build those. We're just going to build our new data set. And we've successfully generated that data set. The final portion of the training walks us through some more advanced workflows. It doesn't provide us instructions on how to implement those workflows, but it does point us to documentation and give us some pointers. I'm not going to go through those, but I want to call a few things out. First, a little more superficially, I tend to like to color the inputs by choosing a color here for our inputs. Let's make our inputs maybe slightly orange. Call these inputs. It's a way to kind of visually draw us to the inputs and outputs. You can save, okay? The documentation tutorial also walks you through this use of reusables. Very useful, especially if you are using external user-defined functions, or you'd like to define a function you want to reuse throughout your pipeline, or if you'd like to parameterize your pipeline, if there's a constant that you'd like to apply but only change it in one place, that's where you can use that. I want to spend just a second here talking about pipeline segmentation. You'll notice one of the features of Pipeline Builder is that you define a set of inputs, you apply some transformations, and you define one set of outputs. What you can't do from there, as we can see on the screen here, is if I click on one of our materialized data sets, one of my options is not another transform. So it ends with a set of outputs. Now, those outputs may very well be used as inputs to another stage in the pipeline. What I have on the screen here is an example of a segmented pipeline. I have a raw folder, clean folder, enriched, and ontology. And within each of these, I have a pipeline step that takes a series of inputs, runs them through some kind of transformation, and generates the outputs. Those outputs are then used in the next stage. So if I click into the enriched pipeline builder artifact, those same data sets are used here. We're now enriching to generate yet another series of outputs, and so forth, as long as your workflow needs to transform data. The documentation talks about best practices for segmenting the pipeline. One thing that I did here that we can take a look at really quickly is a pipeline represented in data lineage. Here is the exact pipeline we just built, but constructed in data lineage. In my segmented pipeline, it won't look this way for yours, but for the one that I generated here, if I color this either by project or by folder, I can more easily see how these pipeline builder artifacts can be strung together to construct a larger pipeline. I like to think of pipeline builder as a pipeline segment builder, and those pipeline segments can be joined together to construct a large production pipeline. So make sure you take a look at the material that's in the additional considerations and best practices section, and I hope you enjoy building pipelines in Foundry.